Before legends of monsters with fangs and capes, before silent castles and moonlit myths, there was a man whose reality was darker than any story ever written, a man whose name whispered through Europe long before fiction tried to tame it. His name was Vlad, and the world would remember him not as a creature of the night, but as something far more unsettling, a ruler who understood fear better than any king of his era. Tonight you and I walk into the shadows of his world, a world where power was measured, not by gold or armies, but by the ability to shape human fear into a weapon. And Vlad, the ruler of a small territory called Wallachia, mastered that weapon with chilling perfection. Imagine the 15th century. The land is fractured, brutal, uncertain. Empires rise and collapse overnight. The Ottoman forces push relentlessly from the east. The Hungarian crown pulls from the west. The villages caught in between live with one truth: survival depends on the strength of the man sitting on the throne or the threat he represents. Into this violent landscape Vlad was born, not into comfort but into betrayal, captivity and constant conflict. As a young boy, he and his brother were taken as political hostages. Their childhood was shaped by pressure, manipulation, and the heavy shadow of war. It was during these years that Vlad learned something the world would never forget: that fear could bend nations more effectively than armies. When he finally claimed the throne of Wallachia, he returned not as a victim, but as a ruler determined to reshape his homeland with discipline. So harsh it would echo across history, he believed that a leader must be unbreakable, and that mercy could sometimes lead to disaster. In the corner of Europe, where enemies surrounded him on all sides, Vlad forged his rule on a single principle: intimidation. Good achieve what diplomacy could not, but fear alone was not enough. Vlad understood that fear must be demonstrated, that a ruler must create symbols that speak louder than words, louder than threats, louder than reason. And so began the ritual that would define his name forever, a ritual that transformed him into a figure so terrifying that even centuries later novelists would borrow his legacy to shape the most iconic creature. This is where history becomes almost too surreal to believe. Vlad developed a method of punishment that his enemies could never ignore. He turned consequences into spectacle, warnings into unforgettable scenes. Every ruler of the era used harsh justice, but Vlad refined it into something closer to psychological warfare. His actions were designed not just to punish, but to send a message so powerful that it would travel through villages, kingdoms, and eventually through time itself. Reports from chroniclers describe long roads leading to his capital lined with his warnings, each one a reminder of the fate that awaited invaders and traitors alike. But what made it most terrifying was not the physical act itself. It was the meaning behind it, the ritualistic precision, the theatrical presentation, the way it shattered the morale of anyone who opposed him. Word spread quickly. Soldiers sent to confront Vlad would hesitate. Envoys would tremble simply hearing his name. Foreign kings considered him unpredictable, unstoppable, and deeply unsettling. In an age before newspapers, before photography, before the internet, Vlad understood the power of reputation better than any ruler alive. His message traveled faster than armies, and the world listened. But there was another side to him, a side often forgotten. Beneath the terrifying stories, within his borders, he insisted on strict order and loyalty. His rule was harsh, but in a land torn by corruption and repeated invasions, many saw him as a necessary force. To some, he was a defender who protected Wallachia from empires far larger and stronger. To others, he was the embodiment of justice taken to a fearful extreme. The truth, like most truths from dark centuries, lies somewhere between fear and admiration. As his reputation grew, storytellers began to embellish the accounts of his actions. They painted him as more Then a ruler, they turned him into an omen, a symbol of absolute dominance and unshakable resolve. Across Europe, travelers carried tales of the Wallachian prince, who ruled through terror so profound that even mighty sultans hesitated to face him directly, and it was from these very stories, these whispered accounts of a ruler who commanded fear like a weapon, that a new kind of legend would eventually be born, a legend that had nothing to do with reality, yet everything to do with the atmosphere Vlad created around himself centuries later. An Irish novelist searching for inspiration would stumble upon these tales. He would learn of the prince who ruled with iron discipline, who faced impossible odds, who allowed no disobedience, a prince whose name carried a weight darker than night. And from this research, he would borrow a single word that would echo forever in literature and cinema: Dracula. But before that legendary creature existed, there was only Vlad, a man shaped by conflict, driven by survival, and remembered by the ritual that defined his rule. And that ritual is where the story truly begins. As Vlad's rule tightened, stories began to spread across villages and mountain passes. Travelers whispered that the prince did not simply enforce order. He crafted demonstrations meant to reach the deepest corners of the human mind. To those living in Wallachia, these displays were warnings. To his enemies, they were messages carved into memory. Approach this land carefully, or do not approach at all. This was the heart of what many would later call a ritual, not in a mystical sense, but in its precision, repetition, and symbolic purpose. Vlad understood that fear could be organized, choreographed, almost orchestrated. He wanted his enemies to feel not only threatened, but completely uncertain. Imagine the landscape: quiet hills, dense forests, and long rural roads. A place where travelers often walked alone, hearing only the wind and the distant howl. In such a setting, even the smallest signs of danger could overwhelm. And Vlad knew this. He used the land itself as a stage. When someone betrayed him, or when invaders crossed into his territory, he responded with actions that carried psychological weight far beyond the borders of Wallachia. Chroniclers from neighboring kingdoms described rows of wooden stakes. These displays were designed not to glorify violence, but to weaken the courage. To modern ears, these reports may sound exaggerated, even impossible, but that is precisely how legends are born, from a mixture of truth. In the 15th century, news traveled slowly, morphing as it passed from mouth to mouth. What one soldier described as a small display of discipline could become an entire field marked by the prince's warning signs. But even through layers of exaggeration, one reality remains clear: Vlad mastered. He created scenes so striking that even hardened warriors hesitated. The Ottoman Empire, one of the most powerful forces of the time, began to see Wallachia not as a simple territory, but as a place ruled by a man who valued fear. And fear works differently from steel or fire. Steel can be broken, fire can be extinguished, but fear lives in the mind. Fear shapes decisions, weakens resolve, and makes even powerful armies question. This was Vlad's strategy. He was vastly outnumbered, facing an empire. He couldn't afford long battles or drawn-out sieges. He needed an edge, so he turned intimidation into his strongest defense. Travelers reported that entire groups of soldiers turned back after seeing. Leaders hesitated to press forward. Envoys described the prince as a man. Diplomacy with him was unpredictable because his approach didn't follow. This unpredictability only strengthened his aura. A leader who does. But a leader who breaks conventional patterns becomes a figure of legend. Vlad didn't fight against these stories. He embraced them, he let. And yet, despite the terrifying reputation spreading across Europe, many of his own people viewed him differently. To them, he was a strict. They lived under his rules, but they also experienced the safety. The same actions that horrified outsiders sometimes earned admiration. This duality, terror abroad, stability at home, is what makes Vlad. He was not simply a villain, nor simply a defender. He was a reflection. Still, there was a point when his ritual of intimidation reached its peak. This event would later become one of the catalysts for transforming Vlad's memory. That moment was known as the creation of the forest, a scene. It was not a real forest, of course, but a symbolic one, a message. As the Sultan's army marched closer to Vlad's territory, expecting resistance, something that was not a battlefield, nor a fortress, nor a diplomatic. They found a sight meant to break their spirit before the battle. What they saw would change the course of their campaign and push Vlad. A scene so chilling that even centuries later, when Bram Stoker, and it is here, standing before this infamous forest, that the Ottoman forces advanced with confidence, expecting a difficult campaign, but not one. They believed they were marching toward another rebellious province, another territory. But as they crossed into Wallachia, something shifted. The land grew quiet, villages seemed abandoned, even the animals stayed hidden. It was as if the entire region held its breath, waiting. Then, on a narrow road, leading deeper into Vlad's territory, the soldiers saw something in the distance, something rising from the earth like a dark silhouette against the pale morning sky. At first, they assumed it was a natural formation, perhaps trees, perhaps a wooden structure belonging to a nearby settlement. But as they approached, the shapes sharpened, and whispers of uncertainty began to spread. What stood before them was not a forest, yet it resembled one. Countless wooden stakes rose from the ground, each one positioned with deliberate spacing, forming rows that extended far beyond the reach of the eye. It was an organized display, crafted not by nature, but by intention. The Ottoman commanders paused, unsure of how to interpret the scene. It was not a battlefield, not a fortification, not a trap. It was something else entirely. A message sculpted into the very soil of Wallachia. A message that said, "Turn back. You do not belong here. This land has a ruler who understands fear better than you understand war." The soldiers hesitated. Some stepped back. Others froze where they stood, their breathing tight. Even seasoned warriors, accustomed to the harsh realities of medieval conflict, felt something cold settle inside their chests. Because this display was not merely physical, it was psychological. It was crafted to communicate absolute dominance without a single word spoken. Chroniclers later wrote that the Sultan himself, upon reaching the scene, looked upon it in silence. He did not shout commands or express anger. Instead, he studied the arrangement, the scale, the eerie stillness surrounding the stakes. The wind moved gently through them, producing a low, unsettling sound, a kind of whispering tone that added to the tension of the moment. What made this forest so effective was not the material used, nor the number of stakes. It was the implication behind it. It showed preparation, planning, determination. Vlad wanted his enemies to understand that he was willing to take his defense of Wallachia to extremes most rulers would never dare consider. He wanted them to feel that by stepping onto his land, they were crossing into the domain of a leader who would not surrender, not negotiate, and would not yield to intimidation. The Sultan recognized the psychological power of what he saw. He understood that his soldiers were shaken, their confidence cracked. Many accounts suggest he even admired Vlad's determination, despite being his adversary. Leadership, after all, is not always defined by mercy or diplomacy. Sometimes it is defined by the ability to command fear. Word of the forest spread quickly. Soldiers who had not yet reached the front heard fragmented descriptions, each more dramatic than the last. Even those who tried to remain composed felt unease working its way into their thoughts. It became clear that defeating Vlad would be far more complicated than expected. They were not simply fighting a territorial prince. They were facing a strategist who controlled not only the battlefield, but the emotions of those who dared challenge him. For Vlad, this was precisely the outcome he wanted. He could not match the Ottomans' numbers or wealth, but he could weaken them where it mattered most. Their spirit. He built his reputation piece by piece, by display, until it became a shield stronger than any armor and a weapon sharper than any blade. And as the Ottoman forces eventually retreated from Wallachia, the forest remained standing. It became a symbol, not only of Vlad's severity, but of his ability to manipulate perception and myth. Travelers who later passed through the region would see the empty stakes and tell stories of the prince who ruled through psychological might. Over time, these stories twisted and expanded, taking on a life of their own. Some described Vlad as a monster, others as a protector, many as something in between. His image grew darker, more mysterious, more supernatural in tone. People who never met him, never saw Wallachia, began to speak of him as if he existed, somewhere between man and legend. This transformation was not created by one event alone. It was built through repetition, through fear, through the ritualistic structure of his displays. And it was this very transformation, this aura of dread mixed with fascination, that would eventually cross borders, languages and centuries. When later writers and historians stumbled upon the tales, they found them irresistible. Among them was an Irish author searching for the foundation of a Gothic villain. He read of Vlad's leadership, his strict discipline, his eerie reputation, and the symbolic forest that had shaken empires. In these stories, he saw the perfect seed for a character who lived beyond death, commanded the night, and inspired fear with the mere mention of his name. And so, piece by piece, the man known as Vlad, ruler of Wallachia, began to merge with a new identity. A fictional count who drank more fear than blood, who lived in a castle overlooking shadowed lands, who embodied the dread his historical counterpart had crafted so effectively. But before the legend of that count could rise, Vlad's real story had one more stage to unfold. One final chapter of ambition, betrayal, and unbroken resolve. A chapter that would complete the transformation of a human ruler into one of the most enduring figures of dark folklore. And that last chapter is where history and myth collide. As the years passed, Vlad's legend continued to grow, carried by allies, enemies, and the countless travelers who crossed the Carpathian region. His reputation reached courts far beyond Wallachia, inspiring both fear and reluctant respect. To many, he was a ruler who stood against overwhelming odds. To others, he was a figure whose methods defied conventional morality. But no matter the perspective, one truth remained: Vlad had become impossible to ignore. His later years were marked by shifting alliances and political tension. In a land surrounded by powerful empires and unstable loyalties, Vlad's position was always at risk. He was imprisoned, released, restored, and challenged again. Every rise brought new expectations, every fall brought new rumors, and every return to power added another layer to the myth being woven around him. Despite the turbulence of his rule, one thing never changed: his belief that Wallachia had to be defended at any cost. He saw his land as a place constantly threatened by foreign influence and internal betrayal. His strict approach to leadership came from a world where weakness invited invasion and hesitation could lead to catastrophe. For Vlad, strength was more than strategy, it was survival. But no ruler, no matter how feared, escapes the turbulence of history. Eventually, Vlad's alliances fractured, old enemies resurfaced, support wavered. In the chaos of political struggles and shifting loyalties, his final years faded into the same shadows he once commanded so powerfully. The exact details of his end remain uncertain, as if history itself hesitated to close the book on a figure so drenched in rumor and contradiction. Some chronicles claim he fell in battle, others suggest betrayal. Some even whisper that his end was as mysterious as his legend. What is known is that Vlad's departure from the stage of history did not weaken his influence. It strengthened it. A life surrounded by darkness, fear, and extraordinary will did not conclude with Silence, instead, it opened the door for something new, a transformation from man to myth. When storytellers began to recount his tale, they found a ruler whose real actions were already so dramatic that they seemed crafted for fiction. His strategies, his intensity, the symbolic displays that marked his reign, all of it felt larger than life. And so the world began reshaping him, embellishing details, filling gaps, and molding him into a character who belonged not only to history, books, but also to the realm of imagination. It was centuries later, in the late 19th century, that an author named Bram Stoker encountered the stories of Vlad, reading through accounts left by diplomats, travelers, and early historians. Stoker found inspiration in the prince's imposing presence and the atmosphere of dread surrounding his name. The more he read, the more he sensed that Vlad's story carried a unique darkness, not supernatural but psychological. Stoker did not recreate Vlad's life. Instead, he extracted something deeper, the essence of intimidation, the ability to unsettle, the commanding aura that shaped legends. From this essence, he imagined a new figure, a count living in a towering castle in the mountains of Transylvania, a being whose presence alone chilled the hearts of those who crossed his path. He borrowed a single word from history, Dracula, a name linked to Vlad's lineage, meaning son of the dragon, or in some interpretations, son of the devil. That word alone carried centuries of weight, fear, and fascination. It fit perfectly within the Gothic world Stoker was building, a world of mystery, isolation, and haunting silence. And so the fictional Count Dracula was born, not as a direct portrayal of Vlad, but as a distant echo, a symbolic descendant of the fear Vlad once commanded in life, a character who absorbed the atmosphere of Wallachian legends and transformed them into something timeless. The world embraced the story. Dracula became one of the most iconic figures in literature and cinema. Audiences were captivated by the Gothic imagery, the ancient castle, the mysterious count, who walked between shadow and moonlight. And though the character had little in common with the real Vlad, the connection persisted. It still persists today. Books, films, documentaries, each one returns to the same question: how much of the legend came from the prince who ruled Wallachia with such chilling authority? The answer is simple. Dracula is fiction, but the fear that inspired him was real. Vlad's legacy remains a paradox. He fought against invaders with determination, yet used extreme displays to send his message. He protected his land harshly, yet created symbols that would haunt European imagination. He was shaped by a world far more brutal than the one we know today, and he responded to it with a level of psychological strategy that made him unforgettable. And perhaps that is why his story endures, because it asks questions that go beyond history, questions about power, about fear, about the fine line between protector and tyrant, about how memory transforms individuals into legends and legends into myths. Today, when people hear the name Dracula, they think of a supernatural being, a creature who stalks the night, who lives forever, who embodies darkness. But behind that character stands a real man, a ruler who lived in a land of conflict, who faced enemies far stronger than himself, who understood the mind as well as the battlefield, and who left behind a legacy woven from equal parts fear and fascination. So when you imagine Dracula's castle, his unsettling charisma, his dominance over those around him, remember that these ideas were shaped in part by the shadow of Vlad, the ruler who mastered the art of intimidation long before fiction gave him fangs and immortality. The true origins of the legendary count are not supernatural at all. They are rooted in the choices of a leader who believed that fear could defend a kingdom, a leader whose actions carved a path into the darkest corners of European memory. a leader whose shadow stretched centuries into the future, and that shadow still lingers.